You might think you know the Lee family history, but did you know that not a single one of Robert E. Lee's 4 daughters ever walked down the aisle? One of them was even thrown in jail for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated streetcar, which is a twist nobody sees coming. The drama surrounding General Lee's 7 children involves plot twists and turns that are honestly wilder than a soap opera script. We are talking about everything from a son who became a prestigious college president and famously sued the United States government, to a daughter who became a globe-trotting adventurer living well into World War I. The fate of the Lee dynasty after the Civil War is filled with surprises. Let's kick things off with child number 7, the man bearing a heavy name, George Washington Custis Lee. Born way back in 1832, Custis wasn't just named after his maternal grandfather, George Washington Parke Custis. He was born carrying the crushing expectations of both the Washington and Lee family dynasties on his shoulders. He wasn't exactly the life of the party. He grew up to be an incredibly serious, nose-in-a-book kind of guy. In fact, the man was brilliant, graduating at the very top of his class at West Point in 1854, perfectly mirroring the academic success his father had achieved years earlier. When Virginia decided to secede, Custis didn't hesitate to follow in his dad's footsteps, resigning his commission in the United States Army to join the Confederacy in 1861. For most of the Civil War, he was stationed right in the heart of the action, in Richmond. He quickly climbed the ranks to become a Confederate general and landed the high-pressure gig of aide-de-camp to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, serving as a top-tier military advisor in the capital. When everything started crumbling in the war's final days, Custis was on the front lines, commanding troops during the desperate and chaotic defense of Petersburg and Richmond. Talk about bad timing. He was actually captured at Sailor's Creek just a few days before his father famously surrendered at Appomattox. After the dust settled and the war ended, Custis Lee had to navigate a world that was completely unrecognizable from the one he was born into. With his father's legendary name and reputation looming over him, everyone expected him to take charge. And surprisingly, he really stepped up to the plate. In 1871, Custis took over his father's role as the president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. Eventually, the school was renamed Washington and Lee University to permanently honor the family legacy. Custis ran the show there for 26 years, ensuring the Lee family remained deeply connected to the institution while educating a whole new generation of young men. But one of the most dramatic chapters of his post-war life was his intense legal battle to get the family's Arlington estate back. In the 1870s, he actually sued the federal government, arguing that Arlington had been seized illegally during the war. In a massive victory, the United States Supreme Court agreed with him in a landmark 1882 decision, ruling 5-4 in his favor. Technically, this win meant Custis regained the title to Arlington and the 1,100 acres surrounding it, which by then had already become Arlington National Cemetery. Obviously, since the land was now a sacred burial ground for thousands of soldiers, Custis had zero intention of evicting the fallen or digging anyone up. Instead, he made a smart move and agreed to a settlement. In 1883, the government wrote him a check for $150,000, a massive fortune in those days, to officially buy Arlington House and the grounds. By doing this, Custis secured some serious compensation for his family's loss, while ensuring Arlington would remain the nation's most hallowed military cemetery. Despite being a public figure with these high-profile victories, Custis Lee was an intensely private, almost painfully shy person. He never married or had any children, possibly because the war's aftermath left him with no home and no money to offer a potential wife at the time. As he got older, he lived a quiet, low-key life, moving in with his younger brother Rooney's family at a country estate known as Ravensworth. Custis remained active in veteran events and served as the respected elder statesman of the Lee clan. When he finally passed away in 1913 at the age of 80, it truly marked the end of an era. He was the very last surviving Confederate general from the Lee family, and one of the final links to the old-world aristocracy of antebellum Virginia. Custis Lee was buried alongside his family in Lexington, having spent his entire life dedicated to duty, education, and protecting his father's complicated legacy. Next up at number 6 is Mary Custis Lee, born in 1835 and named after her mother. She was 25 when the Civil War broke out, and she was just as die-hard of a rebel as her parents. However, don't expect Mary Custis Lee's life to look anything like the typical Southern belle story. Her path took a very different trajectory from the traditional marriage and housekeeping life you would expect from a 19th century Virginia debutante. Mary actually grew into a fiercely independent and totally unconventional woman for her time, eventually spending a huge chunk of her life jet-setting abroad, far away from Virginia. During the fighting, Mary and her sisters did exactly what you'd expect high society Southern ladies to do. They volunteered in hospitals, knitted endless pairs of socks and gloves for Confederate soldiers, and dealt with the nightmare of being displaced from their homes. For most of the conflict, Mary stuck close to her mother in Richmond, since they couldn't return to the occupied Arlington estate. Once the war ended and her dad took the college job, Mary lived with her parents for a bit in Lexington, Virginia. But sitting still wasn't her style. She was restless, headstrong, and thanks to her mother's side of the family, she had a nice inheritance coming. And once the federal government finally paid out that settlement for Arlington, Mary suddenly had a serious amount of personal cash at her disposal. Starting in the 1870s, Mary Custis Lee did something that was considered pretty scandalous and daring for a single woman of her era. She decided to become a world traveler, staying happily single and feeling absolutely no need to do what society expected of her. Using her share of the money from the sale of Arlington, Mary took off on epic journeys across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and basically anywhere else she wanted to go. She was the ultimate jet-setter of her era, making high-profile stops in England to rub elbows with Queen Victoria, and even securing a private meeting with Pope Leo XIII in Rome. Her travels took her through the Holy Land and to exotic, far-flung destinations, including Egypt, India, Ceylon, China, Japan, and the land down under, Australia. Mary had an insatiable thirst for adventure, and, let us be real, she absolutely loved the VIP treatment and celebrity status that came with being the daughter of General Robert E. Lee. That famous last name was like a golden key, unlocking doors to high society circles all over the planet. However, Mary's rebellious, independent streak also flared up in much smaller, more local ways. In 1902, when she was back home in Virginia, the 67-year-old Mary Custis Lee found herself in handcuffs, sparking a scandal that had everyone talking. The reason for the drama? She flat out refused to move from the section reserved for white passengers on a segregated streetcar in Alexandria, insisting on sitting next to her African-American maid instead. You have to remember, this act of defiance happened decades before Rosa Parks became a household name. The Jim Crow laws were in full swing at the time, making Mary's blatant refusal to comply incredibly shocking, especially for a woman with her aristocratic pedigree. The arrest was a lightning rod for controversy and was later used by some advocates to argue for desegregation, although historians are still arguing over what Mary was actually thinking. Was she taking a principled stand for civil rights? Or was she just a stubborn aristocrat who hated being told what to do? Either way, the incident cemented her reputation as the family eccentric. After the streetcar scandal, Mary seemed to brush off the drama, hopping right back on a ship to Europe, where she preferred the more relaxed and permissive social atmosphere. Unlike her siblings, Mary Custis Lee never tied the knot. By all accounts, she cherished her personal freedom way too much, and likely viewed the institution of marriage as a trap that would suffocate her independent spirit. She also spent massive chunks of time estranged from her kin. In a move that shocked people, Mary did not even show up for the funerals of her sisters or her parents, usually because she was traveling overseas. This emotional distance earned her a rather chilly reputation as the most cold-hearted of the Lee siblings, at least according to her dutiful sister Mildred, who once bitterly complained that Mary had abandoned them to bear their sorrow all alone. But Mary made no apologies for who she was, a totally free spirit who lived life on her own terms. In November of 1918, just as World War I was winding down, Mary Custis Lee passed away at the age of 83 at a resort in Hot Springs, Virginia. It is remarkable to think she lived long enough to watch the world her father fought for transform completely into the modern 20th century. She witnessed the United States become one nation again, and even saw American troops fighting side by side with their former enemies on foreign soil. Mary was the very last surviving child of Robert E. Lee. With her passing in 1918, that entire generation, the direct descendants of the famous general, faded into the history books. Coming in at number 5 is William Henry Fitzhugh, better known as Rooney Lee. Born in 1837 at the Arlington estate, Rooney inherited a serious double dose of elite Virginia bloodlines. He was named in honor of his maternal grandmother's family, the Fitzhughs, and he could trace his lineage back to Light Horse Harry Lee, the Revolutionary War hero who was Robert's father. Yet, despite having such an intimidating family tree, Rooney Lee was famous for being laid back, the life of the party, and easily the most likable of all the Lee kids. As a youngster, he was so massive and energetic that his dad joked Rooney was too big to be a man, too small to be a horse, and might need a tight rein just to keep him under control. Back in the 1850s, young Rooney got a real taste of life up north. He studied at Harvard University for a while and became quite the socialite in Boston circles, though sitting in a classroom ultimately could not hold his attention. By 1857, pulling some strings with General Winfield Scott, Rooney snagged a commission in the U.S. Army and went off to see some action out west. He jumped into the fray, joining the military campaign against the Mormons out in the Utah Territory. However, he soon got bored with the slow pace of peacetime Army life, resigning in 1859 to settle down into what he assumed would be a quiet life as a gentleman farmer. He married Charlotte Wickham that same year, and his grandfather, George Custis, gave him the White House plantation located on the Pamunkey River in Virginia as a wedding gift. And yes, it was actually named White House. It had been the property of Martha Washington and was part of the massive inheritance passed down to Mary Custis Lee. Then the Civil War broke out. Just like his brothers, Rooney suited up and joined the Confederate Army in 1861. He rode as a cavalry officer under the legendary General J.E.B. Stuart and quickly built a reputation as a fearless and highly competent leader on the battlefield. He commanded the 9th Virginia Cavalry, and by 1863, he had climbed the ladder to the rank of Major General. Rooney Lee definitely had a roller coaster of a war experience. He charged into numerous battles, fighting directly under his father's command within the Army of Northern Virginia. In June of 1863, only weeks before the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg, Rooney took a bullet during a fierce cavalry clash at Brandy Station. While he was trying to recover at his wife's family estate, Union forces swooped in and captured him. The feds shipped him off to a prison in New York, where he languished as a POW for 8 months before being exchanged in early 1864. He managed to get back to Confederate service just in time to face the grueling siege of Petersburg. Tragically, the war absolutely destroyed Rooney's young family. His wife Charlotte passed away in 1863 while he was locked up in prison, and their 2 young children also died from illness during the conflict. One of his sons, Rob, who was named after his grandfather, died of typhoid fever as a toddler, right around the time Union troops burned the White House plantation to the ground in 1862. By the time the war ended, Rooney Lee had lost his home, his wife, and all of his children. It was a crushing personal blow, a tragedy that his father, General Lee, surely mourned alongside him. After the Confederacy collapsed, Rooney was paroled and simply went back to the only life he had left to him, working the land on a plantation. Following the conflict, he retreated to the newly restored White House estate, trading his uniform for the quiet life of a planter. It wasn't long before romance re-entered the picture. By 1867, Rooney found a second chance at love, tying the knot with a Virginian socialite named Mary Tabb Bowling. The couple didn't waste time securing the dynasty, welcoming several children who helped solidify the Lee lineage. Between Rooney and his brother Rob, they eventually blessed the patriarch with over 20 grandchildren. These were direct heirs who would carry the torch for generations. Rumor has it that Rooney was adamant about maintaining the high society atmosphere and genteel customs he grew up with at the legendary Arlington estate. We're talking about the full aristocratic routine, formal evening tea, nightly prayers, and Sunday hymns, rigidly preserving the domestic rituals his mother had drilled into him during his youth. However, a man of his stature couldn't remain in the shadows forever. The allure of the spotlight was too strong. He threw his hat into the political ring during Reconstruction, a chaotic period when former Confederates were initially blacklisted from power before slowly clawing their way back to influence. By the 1880s, William Rooney Lee had successfully rebranded himself, winning a seat as a Democratic congressman representing the 8th District of Virginia in the U.S. House. It is actually a mind-blowing turn of events when you really think about it. Less than 25 years after waging open war against the United States, Robert E. Lee's own flesh and blood stood in the Capitol, swearing allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, in the very city that Union troops had sacrificed their lives to protect. Surprisingly, Rooney wasn't a firebrand. He emerged as a moderate, widely respected figure who championed Virginia's economic recovery from the ashes of war. He held on to that seat from 1887 until the very end. Sadly, in the fall of 1891, a sudden illness claimed Rooney Lee's life at the relatively young age of 54. He passed away while still in office, dying as a sitting congressman with his political boots on, so to speak. They laid him to rest in the family crypt in Lexington, just a stone's throw from his legendary father. Out of all the siblings, Rooney was arguably the most successful at navigating the tightrope between a normal existence and high-profile public service. He had survived the horrors of the battlefield and endured heartbreaking personal losses. Yet he still managed to reinvent himself completely, leaving behind a dual legacy, a thriving family tree that kept the name alive, and a respectable career in the halls of Congress. To the veterans who served under his father, Rooney was an icon, one of their own. But to the rising generation of Virginians, he served as a living bridge connecting the Old South to the New South, a complex figure who embodied both eras. Moving on to sibling number 4. Let's talk about Anne Carter Lee. Entering the world in June of 1839, Annie was famous for her incredibly sweet disposition, earning her the heartwarming nickname, My Gentle Annie, from her doting father. She wasn't just a wallflower. She was the life of the family gatherings, known for a warm vibe and a self-deprecating wit that often led to playful pranks and jokes. Annie shared an intense bond with her younger sister, Agnes. With only a 2-year age gap between them, the pair were practically joined at the hip. Their connection was so obvious that the rest of the family simply grouped them together as the girls, often describing them poetically as twin roses growing on a single stem. In the pre-war days, the duo was inseparable, sharing a bedroom, swapping toys, and leaning on each other through the drama of boarding school and the various sicknesses that plagued their childhood. Beyond being a beloved sister, Annie stepped up to fill a unique and crucial role within the household dynamic. When their mother's rheumatoid arthritis flared up badly in the late 1850s, it was Annie who took the reins, managing the estate and even acting as a tutor for her baby sister Mildred. Her heart was genuinely made of gold. In a bold move that defied Virginia's strict laws at the time, young Annie secretly taught enslaved children at Arlington to read and write, displaying a level of compassion and bravery that was way beyond her age. When the war finally exploded, 21-year-old Annie's world was turned upside down, plunging her into the same chaos that engulfed the rest of the clan. She and Agnes fled to Ravensworth, a relative's plantation for safety. While there, they scrambled to hide the family treasures, stashing away silver heirlooms and oil portraits to keep them out of Union hands. By 1862, with their beloved Arlington estate officially lost to the enemy, Annie reunited with her mother and sisters at a friend's residence in North Carolina, hoping to ride out the storm in relative safety. Tragedy struck in August of 1862 when Annie contracted typhoid fever. The family prayed the change in scenery would boost her health, but her condition only spiraled downward. In a desperate bid to save her, Agnes and their mother, Mary, vigiled by her bedside in a small cottage at White Sulphur Springs, North Carolina, doing everything they could. Agnes refused to leave her sister's side for a second. In a heartbreaking moment, she actually crawled into the bed to hold Annie, trying to use her own body heat to stop her sister's violent shivering. On October 20th, 1862, the fight ended. Annie Lee passed away at the devastatingly young age of 23. Her final breath was spent whispering a soft plea for her other half. "Where is Agnes?" It was a gut-wrenching testament to the inseparable bond these two sisters shared. Annie's death absolutely shattered the Lee family. Even the iron-willed General Lee, far away on the front lines in Virginia, completely broke down and wept when the letter delivering the tragic news arrived. In a raw letter to his wife, he confessed, "To know that I shall never see her again on earth is agonizing in the extreme." It was a rare, vulnerable peek behind the curtain, revealing the immense grief hiding behind the general's famous stoic facade. As for Agnes, she was beyond inconsolable. She hadn't just lost a sibling, she had lost her soulmate. The family noted that the light seemed to go out of her, leaving her much quieter and withdrawn. It was as if a piece of Agnes died right there with Annie. To make matters worse, with the war still raging, transporting Annie's body back to Virginia was an impossible mission. So they had to bury her right there in North Carolina, in a modest grave located on the very plantation where she took her last breath. The locals were incredibly kind, eventually putting up a small obelisk to memorialize Miss Annie. It wasn't until 1869, well after the guns fell silent, that Robert E. Lee and Agnes finally made the pilgrimage to visit Annie's resting place, personally thanking the townspeople for tending to her grave with such care. Decades down the line, in 1994, the Lee descendants decided it was time to bring her home. They had Annie's remains exhumed and moved to the family crypt in Lexington, reuniting her with her kin at last. And so, finally, she lies at peace alongside her folks and her brothers and sisters. Moving on to child number 3, we have Eleanor Agnes Lee. Born back in 1841, she was the 5th baby of the bunch and the 3rd girl in the lineup. If Annie was the wild child, Agnes was the serious one, super smart, deeply religious, and the quiet power behind the throne. We actually know a ton about her because she was a dedicated diarist. For 5 straight years, she documented every little detail of the high life at the Arlington estate. She wrote about everything from ice skating parties on the frozen canal to hanging out with massive celebrities of the day, like the writer Washington Irving. They even threw huge birthday bashes for George Washington. Thanks to Agnes spilling the tea in her journals, historians have managed to piece together exactly what went on behind closed doors in the Lee household. You could call her the family historian, but her whole world really revolved around her sister Annie. They were practically inseparable, known simply as the girls, and Agnes didn't really know who she was without her other half. But then, the Civil War tore everything apart. They were forced to flee their home, and in a cruel twist of fate, Agnes had to watch her best friend and sister fade away. When Annie died in 1862, it completely broke Agnes. She was only 21 years old, supposed to be in the prime of her life. But just months later, another tragedy would strike close to home. Right around Christmas of 1862, a handsome distant cousin and childhood pal named Orton Williams came knocking at the Hickory Hill estate, where the Lees were crashing with relatives. Now, here is where the gossip mill starts churning. It was an open secret that Orton and Agnes had a thing for each other, and everyone expected a ring on her finger. Rumors were flying everywhere that the two of them were madly in love, and on the verge of making it official with an engagement. Nobody knows for sure what went down during that holiday visit. One version of the story claims Orton popped the question, but Agnes, terrified of losing someone else she loved, turned him down. Or maybe he got cold feet and never asked at all. Either way, the romance hit a dead end, and Orton left in a hurry, leaving a cloud of mystery behind him. But hold on, because it gets darker. Just 6 months later, in June of 1863, Orton Williams was caught by Union soldiers and executed as a spy. Once again, Agnes was absolutely destroyed. She had lost another person she loved in the blink of an eye. People who knew her said the light just seemed to go out of her after that double whammy of death. The bubbly young woman who filled her diary with fun stories turned into a ghost of her former self. Quiet, serious, and withdrawn. But even with a broken heart, she kept going for her family. Fast forward to the end of the war in 1865, and the shattered Lee clan finally got back together in Richmond. But Agnes couldn't catch a break. She almost immediately caught typhoid fever, the exact same killer disease that had taken her sister Annie. This time, though, luck was on their side. Her mom and her little sister Mildred nursed her back from the brink of death, and she managed to pull through. Although she was still pretty shaky, Agnes packed up and moved with the family to Lexington in late 1865, when her dad took a new job as a college president. Life there started to look a little bit normal again. Agnes became a fixture in the local social scene, known for her elegance and grace. She definitely turned a few heads, too. She had admirers, including a professor from the Virginia Military Institute who tried to woo her, but she gently shut them all down. Marriage was off the table. It seemed like losing her sister and her tragic almost fiancé, Orton, had killed any romantic dreams she ever had. Instead of starting her own family, she dedicated her life to her parents, helping her mom run the social calendar and taking care of her aging father. When General Lee passed away in 1870, the heartbreaking job of preparing his body for the funeral fell to Agnes. She dressed him in the very same suit he had worn to his son Rooney's wedding. She had to do it because her mother Mary was such a wreck from grief that she couldn't even function. Can you imagine the toll that took on her? It brought all the old pain of Annie's death rushing back. After burying her father, Agnes went into a deep, dark depression. Her health, which was never great to begin with, started to spiral downward. By the autumn of 1873, she came down with a nasty intestinal illness. Some say it was typhoid again. Others think it might have been cholera. The history books conflict on the exact diagnosis, but the bottom line was that she was fading fast. On October 12, 1873, exactly the 3rd anniversary of her dad's death, her sister Mildred wrote that Agnes looked exhausted, and they all feared the end was near. In a whisper, Agnes grabbed her big brother Custis and pleaded, "You must not forget me when I am gone." Custis, choking back tears, promised her, "Aggie, none of us will ever do that." 3 days later, on October 15, 1873, Eleanor Agnes Lee took her last breath at the young age of 32. It was 3 years and 3 days after her father died. It was almost as if she simply couldn't survive in a world without the family members she adored so intensely. Her mother, Mary, who was already sick, was completely crushed by losing Agnes. It was the final straw. Mary Anna Lee died just 3 weeks later, on November 5, 1873. The pileup of grief was just too much for her heart to handle. Agnes was buried in the Lee Chapel in Lexington. Just like her sisters, she never walked down the aisle, and left no children behind to carry on her memory. Now, let's switch gears to number 2, Robert E. Lee, Jr. The family called him Rob, or Bob. Born in 1843, he was the baby boy of the clan. He was barely 18 years old when the Civil War kicked off. Just a college kid studying at the University of Virginia. At first, his mom did everything she could to talk him out of enlisting. She wasn't having it. She had already waved goodbye to her husband and her 2 older sons, Custis and Rooney. The thought of sending her baby into the line of fire was a nightmare. But by 1862, with the war heating up, Rob couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore. He signed up as a private with the Rockbridge Artillery and eventually moved up the ranks to become an aide-de-camp for his big brother, General Rooney Lee, in the cavalry. Rob proved his worth and worked his way up to captain before the fighting was all over. There is this incredible story from the Battle of Sharpsburg, also known as Antietam, back in 1862. Young Rob was manning a Confederate battery, blasting away, and he didn't even notice his own dad was right there until General Lee rode up to his unit. The kid was so covered in black gunpowder and dirt, he was unrecognizable. Rob had approached the general, hoping for a warm, fatherly reunion. But amidst the smoke and grime, Lee didn't even recognize that the soldier standing before him was his own flesh and blood. It wasn't until Rob actually opened his mouth to speak that the general realized who he was looking at. And even then, Lee didn't break character. He simply barked out a standard military command. "Yes, my son." He basically told him to get back in there and push the enemy line back. It was a super short, emotionless exchange right in the middle of a war zone, perfectly highlighting the bizarre reality of serving as both a dutiful son and a subordinate to the legendary Robert E. Lee. Despite the cold shoulder, Rob Lee stuck it out and remained in uniform right up until the bitter end of the conflict. Actually, he gave his relatives a massive heart attack in April of 1865, during the chaotic retreat from Petersburg. A bullet took out his horse from right underneath him, leaving him stranded and completely cut off from the main army. For nearly an entire month, the Lee clan had zero clue if Robbie was dead or alive. By the time he managed to scrounge up a fresh horse, it was too little too late. Union troops had already swarmed the area and blocked his path back to General Lee. Rob drifted south and, in a twist of fate, ended up in Greensboro, North Carolina, standing right there when President Jefferson Davis got the crushing news that Lee had thrown in the towel at Appomattox. So Robert Jr. technically skipped the famous surrender at Appomattox, but he didn't run forever. He turned himself in shortly after and got his parole papers. Against all odds, every single one of General Lee's 3 sons made it out of the war alive. A small miracle that his wife would later describe as a massive blessing in a sea of terrible losses. Once the dust settled after 1865, Rob pivoted to his true passion and tried to make a go of it as a simple farmer. Just like his brother Rooney, he had been left a chunk of property by his grandfather Custis, specifically the Roman Coke plantation, located in King William County right along the Pamunkey River. This spot was conveniently located just across the water from Rooney's own White House estate. The 2 brothers ended up living as neighbors, grinding it out during the brutal Reconstruction era, trying to turn a profit from the land when the economy was wrecked and the old labor systems were gone. Rob never struck it rich or amassed a huge fortune, but he was the real deal, working the dirt himself and carving out a modest existence on the soil. Everyone who met him agreed that Rob was easily the most down-to-earth and low-key of all the Lee kids, never chasing fame or trying to run for political office. He did manage to find romance, though. In 1871, at the age of 27, he tied the knot with Charlotte Haxel, a stunning Southern belle from Richmond. But the love story turned into a nightmare way too soon. Charlotte passed away just a few months after the wedding in 1872, with rumors suggesting complications from a tragic miscarriage. Their time together was heartbreakingly short, leaving Rob a widower with no children to show for that first attempt at happiness. It took him a long time to recover, but decades later, in 1894, he walked down the aisle again with Juliet Carter. And that's when he finally started building a family. Rob became a dad to 2 daughters, naming one Anne Carter Lee after the sister he lost, and the other Mary Custis Lee, honoring both his mother and his sister. By choosing those specific names, Rob created a beautiful, living tribute to the Lee women who had shaped his world. But if we look at the big picture, Robert Jr.'s biggest mark on history wasn't farming. It was acting as the guardian of his dad's reputation through writing. The guy was a natural-born storyteller with a warm vibe. Back in 1904, he dropped a major book titled Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, which was a massive compilation of his own private memories, mixed with a treasure trove of his father's personal correspondence. This project gave the world a VIP pass into what daily life was actually like at Arlington, showing the general's character through the adoring eyes of his son. We really have Rob to thank for all the intimate, human details we know about the general today. From his quirky habits to his private thoughts, stuff that would have definitely vanished into history otherwise. The book was a hit when it came out, and remains a crucial primary source for any historian trying to figure out who Robert E. really was. Lee was behind closed doors. As for Robert E. Lee Jr. himself, he survived long enough to see the dawn of the 20th century and even the 50th anniversary of the Civil War, wisely staying out of political drama to focus on his family and writing. On October 19, 1914, Rob passed away in Virginia at 70 years old. By that point, he was one of the very last living links to the original Robert E. Lee clan. Only his big sister Mary outlived him, hanging on for another 4 years. They laid Rob to rest in Lexington, right alongside his famous parents and his siblings. Thanks to Rob's 2 girls and Rooney's kids, the Lee bloodline didn't die out. In fact, between the 2 brothers, there were over 20 direct descendants of Mary and Robert E. Lee still kicking around by the time we hit the 21st century. So, unlike most of his sisters who had no heirs, Rob played a huge role in keeping the family tree alive. Now, let's talk about number 1. Mildred Child Lee. Born way back in 1846, Mildred was a massive 16 years younger than her oldest brother Custis, coming as a total delight to her parents, who affectionately dubbed her Precious Life. Eventually, they shortened that nickname down to just Life, which is pretty adorable. She was the 4th girl in the lineup, and the 7th and final child the couple would ever have. Out of the whole brood, Mildred had arguably the most unique journey, spending the bulk of her years in the gloom of the post-war era, never marrying and dedicating herself entirely to family obligations. When the war kicked off, young Mildred was forced to grow up overnight. She was stuck away at a boarding school in North Carolina when the fighting started in 1861. But by the time she turned 17, the conflict had shut the school down. So she had to head back to Richmond to hunker down with her mom and sisters. Mildred didn't just sit around. She jumped into the Southern cause, spending hours knitting socks for the troops. She made it her personal mission to ensure her dad's army had warm gear, and she even stepped up to volunteer as a nurse in the Confederate hospitals. There is actually a hilarious story from the war years where Mildred tried to tame a wild squirrel she found in Richmond. The little critter turned out to be a total menace, biting everyone and causing chaos until it finally ran off, leaving Mildred the only one heartbroken over its escape. That specific anecdote really captures her essence. A gentle soul with a distinct quirky side, trying to keep it together while the brutality of war raged all around her. Flashback to April of 1865. Mildred was huddled with her mother and sisters in Richmond, witnessing a nightmare scenario as their beloved city literally collapsed and burned to the ground surrounding them. Union General Weitzel actually stepped up and offered them a way out, safe passage away from the chaos. But the Lee women? They stubbornly refused to leave their home, watching in terror as the flames licked just a block away before finally dying down. Once the dust settled after Appomattox, General Lee reunited with the family in Richmond. It was during this period that he and Mildred formed an incredibly tight bond, often seen strolling together through the twilight hours. To put it simply, she was his rock. She became a beacon of light and a massive source of comfort for the aging general during his final chapters. When the clan packed up and moved to Lexington, it marked a huge shift for Mildred. For the first time, she actually got to live with her dad full-time, a luxury she missed out on growing up because of Lee's constant military deployments. She stepped into the role of his right-hand woman, constantly by his side, assisting him and keeping him company while he wrote. Their dynamic was sweet, too. Lee used to roast Mildred, playfully of course, about her absolutely atrocious handwriting and her questionable skills in the kitchen. And let's not forget the army of cats she always had trailing her, which he teased her about endlessly. When General Lee fell terminally ill in 1870, Mildred was right there in the trenches of his care. She manned his bedside during the daylight hours, while Agnes took over the graveyard shift. They would sit there, rubbing his cold hands to generate some warmth, listening to the relentless rain pouring down outside. It hits you right in the feels when you realize the little girl he once fretted over for playing in the sun without a hat was now the grown woman nursing him through his dying breaths. Once her father passed away, Mildred didn't just fade into the background. Her role in the family became more critical than ever before. By that point, her mother Mary was physically incapacitated. To make matters worse, Agnes tragically died in 1873, piling even more heartbreak onto the grieving matriarch. Mildred effectively had to step up as the head of the household. She managed whatever was left of their domestic life and took on the heavy burden of caring for her sick mother until Mary Custis Lee finally passed away late in 1873. Suddenly, at just 27 years old, the family dynamic shifted drastically. Mildred and her eldest sister Mary were the last two Lee women standing, and honestly, they were like oil and water. Mildred was the type who desperately wanted a close connection, while Mary was the total opposite, constantly jet-setting and traveling away from home. These two sisters just did not click. You have to remember, Mary was 11 years older, and her personality was cut from a completely different cloth. As the years rolled by, the gap between them widened instead of shrinking. Mildred actually started to resent Mary for always being gone, feeling like she was left high and dry to deal with all the family drama and burdens alone. Interestingly, Mildred never walked down the aisle and never had kids, a destiny she actually shared with every single one of her sisters. It wasn't for a lack of options, though. After the war, she had plenty of suitors lining up. Young men were naturally attracted to the general's charming and lively daughter back when the Lees were settled in Lexington. But Mildred? She rejected every single one of them. If we're being honest, the reality was that no man could ever stack up against her father in her eyes. She actually wrote about this once, admitting that to her, General Lee was the ultimate hero, and every other man just seemed tiny and insignificant by comparison. When you have that level of hero worship for your dad, it becomes pretty easy to see why she decided to remain single forever. After her mom died, Mildred was technically free to design her own life. But instead of thriving, she found herself feeling a bit lost and adrift. She ended up bouncing around, splitting her living arrangements between her brothers. She'd spend time staying with Custis back in Lexington for a while. She even played the role of his First Lady, acting as the hostess for Washington College events since Custis was a bachelor like her. Other times, she'd head over to Romancoke to crash with her brother Rob. During this wandering period, Mildred found a lot of peace and comfort in her faith and charitable work. She was super active in her local church and was a staple volunteer at charity bazaars and dinners, working hard to raise money for Confederate veterans and the widows left behind by the war. In her later years, it seems she finally took a page out of her sister Mary's playbook and decided to do some international traveling of her own. She went big, visiting England in 1887 for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. She checked out the pyramids in Egypt, toured around the Mediterranean, and spent time exploring France. Despite all that, Mildred couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't really achieved anything that the world needed to know about. When a close family friend suggested writing her biography, Mildred shut it down with a humble reply. She said the true story of her life was stranger, sadder, and more unexplainable than any romance novel you could pick up. That is such a heavy statement coming from someone who lived through that much historical change and personal tragedy. Fast forward to the 1890s, and Mildred and Mary actually managed to reunite a handful of times. Most notably, they stood side by side at the unveiling ceremonies for their father's monuments in New Orleans and Richmond, looking incredibly proud and fiercely protective of his legacy. They also put their differences aside to be there for their brother Rooney, comforting him as he lay on his deathbed in 1891. In those heavy moments, it didn't matter how different they were. The Lee siblings always found a way to come together. By the time the 20th century rolled around, Mildred's health was taking a nosedive. It was likely the long-term fallout from a nasty bout of typhoid she battled back in 1868, the same illness her father had nursed her through. In March of 1905, while she was visiting New Orleans to take in the Mardi Gras festivities, tragedy struck. Mildred suffered a massive stroke. She held on for a bit, but passed away on March 27, 1905, at the age of 59. News of her death sent shockwaves of grief through the South. Flags were actually flown at half-staff across a huge part of the region to honor the passing of Robert E. Lee's last surviving daughter. It truly marked the end of a significant era. Her coffin got a royal escort, accompanied by Confederate veterans and alumni from Washington and Lee University, on a solemn funeral train ride back to Lexington. That's where she was finally laid to rest in the Lee Chapel crypt, right beside her parents and her sister Agnes. It was the fitting end for the family's light-bearer, finally returning home for the very last time. With Mildred's passing, the final curtain fell on the generation of Lee's immediate children. She had truly been the beating heart of the post-war Lee family, the one who stayed put when everyone else scattered, and the one who kept the memory of Mars Robert alive within those walls. Mildred might not have lived a life packed with the explosive drama or public conquests that defined her brothers, but do not underestimate her impact. Through her gentle nature and rock-solid dedication, she became the keeper of the flame, ensuring the dignity and warmth of the Lee family name survived well into the 20th century.